detective. The detective. The detective. 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 The detective is clearly in denial. Detective is... Detective. Detective. Oh, detective. Yeah, detective, I have... But a detective. The detective knows what I really am. Listen, detective. The detective is in... Well, the detective is... Detective. Problem solved, detective. The detective and the detective wants to... The detective. 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 Glad you're curious, detective. 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 Morning, detective. 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 I wouldn't go in there, detective. It's detective. Detective. Detective, there is something I'd like to say to you. I've always been honest with you, detective. Got it, detective, don't worry. Detective. Detective. Detective! No! Don't you know that, detective? Do with the detective. The detective did. The detective would never do that. If detective, then the detective. Doesn't it, detective? Detective? This detective? About the detective. Detective, wouldn't... Detective. Detective. Detective, what's this? Enlighten me, detective. Clever detective. Hello, detective. Or the detective. 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 Detective, I'm sorry. Detective, wait. Please, detective. Stopping to smell the detective. Detective. Detective, you know me so well. Detective. Detective? Not good to go, detective. Detective. Detective, detective. The detective and I. Yeah. Detective. Detective. Oh, detective. You know me, detective? Oh, I'm only vulnerable when the detective's around. Detective. Detective. Crisis averted, detective. 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 Detective! Understood, detective. Nonsense, detective. Oh, detective. Oh, when in Rome, detective. Detective. Me, detective. Detective. Detective, detective. With the detective. Detective's offspring. Detective. Detective. Well, come on then, detective. What did he say? Detective, how can I help? Detective, how can I help you? Detective. With the detective. Detective is detective. Detective is son, detective. Detective, detective. Detective, this has never happened to me before. Detective. 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 Where's the detective? Detective. Detective. Yes, detective. Detective. Detective, what is it? Detective. Of course it does, detective. Detective. It's not hemorrhoids, detective.
Yeah.
Detective! Detective! Detective. 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 Detective is detective. Detective. It's detective. My first love was never Eve. It was you, Chloe. It always has been.
Oh my god. It's just weird and like hard. It's not funny. Get out if you're gonna